Hello and welcome to the Early Career Researcher podcast, your regular discussion on all things relating to the life and work of early career researchers working in the humanities. I'm Charlie, and today I'm joined by Olivia and Rachel as we explore one of the most important questions an early career researcher can ask because it effectively starts your career as a researcher. And that question is, should I apply to do a PhD? Deciding whether or not to do a PhD and then actually applying for one is one of the most important processes of an academic career. And if you're currently applying, it probably feels like the most important decision you'll ever make. But not everybody knows when or how the process works. So we intend to discuss some basic questions about this, touching on subjects such as some of the reasons why people might want to do PhDs, what it can actually be like to do a PhD, and then we'll talk a bit more about how and when you might have a good idea for a topic, and then say a bit more about how the process of applying for humanities PhDs can work. The timing of this podcast is relevant because in UK and European institutions, we're seeking applicants from December to January and applying for PhDs in the new year. We hope that our discussions are helpful, informative, and fun to listen to. And you can follow up by reading our related blog post. If you want to get in touch with further questions or comments or suggestions for topics for discussion, please use the information provided underneath the podcast information. So let's start with that massive question. Why do you want to do a PhD? And I'm going to ask this question of our two co-hosts, Rachel and Olivia, today. Why don't we start with Olivia? Because Olivia is currently in the midst of finishing one of these things. So Olivia, take yourself back to when you wanted to do a PhD. Why? What were your motivations?
Right. Yeah, take myself back. I'm at a stage where thinking about the original motivation is a useful one. I I was very good at school, and I was very good at university. And I did my master's degree in a topic that I was very interested in medieval history. And it was a topic that I wanted to learn about, and I enjoyed learning about, and I thought was important. But it was also a topic that was maybe kind of difficult to relate to academic trends going on at the time. And so I finished my master's degree and I decided not to do a PhD at that point. But I had always, the longer I'd gone through university in a humanities subject, the more I'd kind of known that that was something that I wanted to do. On the basis that I enjoyed studying and I enjoyed asking big questions and having to kind of go through the process of finding the answer. So I took a couple of years out, and I went and I did various other things, and I thought to myself, oh, a PhD would be an indulgence. All you ever study are kind of niche, obscure questions that nobody is interested in. And then I did a variety of other things professionally for a couple of years, and I realized that I didn't enjoy any of them nearly as much as I enjoyed asking big questions and looking critically for the answers. And a big part of that for me was that I felt that a lot of professional work was very reactive and kind of driven by being reactive to kind of events that happen in your daily life or in your industry as they're happening. And what I really enjoyed about academia was the time and the space to think a bit more proactively and kind of take a step back and say what's really going on in these questions that I have, and how do I really make the right kind of choices about what the answers to those questions are, and that kind of thing. So I like being a critic, and I like thinking critically, and that's kind of what drove me towards eventually deciding to go back to school and do a PhD.
That's really interesting. I hope that some of our listeners might recognise some of those thoughts and feelings. I certainly do. So we can come back and circle and talk about some of those in more detail in a minute, I'm sure. But Rachel, why don't you tell us, why did you want to do a PhD?
Thanks, Charlie. A lot of what Olivia was talking about really resonated with me and actually applies to some of the reasons that I want to do a PhD. In terms of, I also was pretty good in school, did pretty well at university, but unlike Olivia, I didn't spend as long actually thinking about why I wanted to do it and whether maybe whether I should be doing it as much. So I finished my master's and kind of went straight into my PhD. And part of that reason is that I've always loved history, like always been really nerdy about medieval history in particular from when I was a child all the way through. And I really wanted to pursue that because it's my passion. But I've also really been interested in being an educator. And in a way, being an academic is a way to combine those two interests. So those are really the two factors that drove me. Although I would say where I chose to do my PhD was definitely influenced by my master's and having enjoyed a supervisory experience and being educated at one particular place kind of definitely helped push me along that path into doing a PhD right away and not stepping back and thinking about it as critically as Olivia did.
I think I'm in my case. Why don't I say a bit about my journey? I'm probably the opposite end of Olivia. If Olivia was nice and measured and kind of calm about the decision process, I was the opposite, and it was purely based on emotion and feeling. And I always knew as an undergraduate that I loved my topic. I really wanted to know more and more about my topic. I was getting good grades. And it was the first time, really, as someone who was good but not amazing at school, when I got to university, I suddenly felt, actually, these are my people. This is my place that I belong in. This is the topic I want to study for the rest of my life. What career options are there for me to just do this for the rest of my life? And I had a chat to a couple of my academics at my university, and they basically said, well, you could do lots of things, but you could also just stay on and do a master's, then you could stay on and do a PhD, then you could try and be an academic. And so pretty much from about the first term of undergrad, I thought, yep, okay, that will do. And obstacles were in the way, like money, life, all those kind of things. We can talk about those later. But I just had this dogged determination. I don't care. I am doing a PhD. And I am doing a PhD because I want to explore my topic for the rest of my life. Not because I want to be some clever person who sits there and says, oh, I'm doing a PhD, look at me. It was more, right, this is where I want to get to in life. And there we go. So far, that's worked out all right, but who knows? Do you have any reactions to that?
I feel like maybe I should clarify a little bit because if I came across as sounding very measured and thoughtful in the process, I'm afraid I can't necessarily make that claim. I also came out of my master's degree desperate to continue studying my topic, and it's also all I really wanted to do, and it felt like the only thing I was really driven to do. I also came out of my master's with no prospects for funding. So when I say I studied very niche questions that nobody was that interested in, part of the issue there was that I struggled. I didn't see any prospects for funding a PhD in those topics, and I was kind of forced to take a step away and think about the world in a slightly like broader way and think about what people are interested in and what can be funded and that kind of thing. And then eventually I came back with a topic that I think had a bit more kind of contemporary relevance to debates that were going on at the time and that kind of thing. So just to be clear, lest listeners feel that it's possible to make this decision in a totally new what is the word I'm looking for? A totally calm and collected and unemotional way. I have a sneaking suspicion that's not really the case.
And also, just to continue that thought, you don't have to start a PhD with a topic that is super relevant to today's world, because a lot of those questions kind of come up. And so even if you start a PhD on what appears to be a super niche topic, you will find as you progress that there are conversations you can have about what's happening in the world right now. Or Olivia, you also mentioned trends in kind of academic history, so like what universities are funding or where research topics are going. Again, these are things that you don't have to necessarily have built in from the beginning. They do naturally crop up sometimes as your research progresses in a PhD. So it's definitely not a deterrent either.
Yeah, that's a good point. I probably could have worked harder, or at least at the end of my master's, I could have put more thought into who was funding and what they were funding and that kind of thing. But yeah, for a variety of reasons.
In the UK though, you just panically trying to finish your masters, aren't you? Because you've only got a year anyway. So the
Yeah.
last thing on your mind is, what am I going to do in 3 years? But
Yeah, exactly.
we
Yeah.
can revisit some of those topics in a minute, but let's move on to the next part of the next section, where we're going to talk through some of the reasons why people might want to do PhDs. So we can kind of outline them in case people are listening and thinking, well, they haven't talked about my reasons yet, and what should I make of these reasons? Are they good or bad? Let's have a talk one by one and see what we make of these categories that we've come up with. And if people have other suggestions, then you're welcome to drop them to us and tell us what you think about them. We can talk about them maybe in a later episode. So the first one, the elephant in the room, the biggest reason I think why people might want to do PhDs is because you want to be an academic. You want to enter the ivory tower of academia and be a researcher, be a professor, and so on. So essentially, a PhD has now become, in our day and age, an essential starting point for that, and you can't really have an academic career anymore without one, if you're working in certain humanities subjects. So we want to do a PhD because we want to be an academic. Who wants to jump in and say some reflections on this topic? What do we think about this reason? Is it a good reason? We're laughing. Why are we laughing? Olivia, why are you laughing?
Why am I laughing? I think partly because the people on this podcast are somewhat self-selected at the moment, in the sense that at least 2 out of 3 of us are currently working, as far as I'm aware, as academics, and I, the third, am working on a PhD towards hopefully a career in academia. And as you say, it's pretty much a prerequisite if one wishes to enter that ivory tower. But I think it's kind of important that we recognize that academia is also not an easy industry to get into, and there's a lot of business practices and a lot of employment practices that are taking place in the industry at the moment that are not entirely kosher, or at the very least make working in this industry pretty difficult. I mean, I really should defer to you two on that topic, because you've experienced it and I haven't yet.
Yeah, Rachel, what kind of things do you think Olivia's talking about there?
Yeah, I mean, you've said it very diplomatically, but some of the big things that we need to think about are precarity and the length of time in which it can take to get a permanent position in academia, and that it's not necessarily guaranteed. And that's one of the biggest things to think about, is if you're doing a PhD to get an academic job, it is not a done deal just because you have a PhD. And so bearing that in mind from the beginning is really important, because I think that you should have a secondary reason as to why you're doing a PhD, and being an academic should not be the only reason that you choose to do that.
I don't mind laying my cards on the table in these podcasts and talking about my personal experience, but I finished my PhD in 2014, so that's now 9 years ago, and I'm now on my 3rd temporary lecturing post, still without a permanent lecturing role. And I've been really lucky that I've never had a massive career break in between those roles. But essentially, I was given my first lecturing job for 2 years, and then I had another lecturing job lined up after that for 1 year, but it got rolled over twice, so it turned into 3 years. And I had a year where I had a bit of a fallow period, and I had to scrape together a job out of about 4 or 5 different part-time jobs. And now I'm on my 3rd temporary lecturing job, and I'm in the 2nd of 3 years on that, and I have no guarantee it's going to lead to anything at the end of that. So if that kind of thing scares you, maybe being an academic is a tricky decision for you to make, but we'll come on to that in some of the kind of bits on what it's like to do a PhD. But yeah, I think the second reason, if we're happy to move on to that one, and we can circle back if we need to, a related motivation for why you might want to do a PhD would be just a sense of a basic life ambition to get a PhD. I really need to get a PhD for me to be happy in my life. It's something I've always wanted to do. I've got this inbuilt pursuit of knowledge that I need to try and realize. And that can be a good motivating factor for wanting to do a PhD. Did either of you have that when you were applying?
I don't think that I
Yeah.
particularly felt that I needed a PhD, but certainly because I enjoyed studying history so much that there definitely was that pursuit of knowledge aspect that I was like, this is something I really want to do. But I don't think it's something I ever necessarily thought I would do for a long period of time. But I don't know about you, Olivia.
I'm not sure I ever thought of it as like I must have a PhD, like a degree certificate. I think I probably thought of it as I would like to spend time critically thinking about questions that are of interest to me, and I don't want to have to be employed doing other things in the meantime. I mean, like I don't want to do it in just like on my spare evenings.
Yeah.
Realistically, I am employed doing other things in the meantime, but that's the idea is that it supports the amount of time I'm able to spend thinking and investigating and researching. I'm also not a first generation doctorate in my family, if that makes sense. One of my
That's
parents has a
interesting.
doctorate as well, so I think it was kind of set up for me from childhood as a kind of aspirational thing, for better or for worse. I think I probably could have interrogated that a little bit more than I did. But like having a PhD seemed like a good thing, but I think for me it was more a question of being interested in being able to spend that time and get and like acquire the skills that I knew came with being able to spend that amount of time thinking it
Well,
through.
should we move on to training and skills? Because I had that one further down the list, but you mentioned it, so let's go for it.
Sure.
Do you think people apply for PhDs because they want specific training and skills? It sounds like you did, Olivia. Critical thinking. What other skills are you talking about that a PhD can kind of give you for maybe the world of work or maybe just life skills?
Yeah, I think for me a big part of it was like writing and communication skills, which I find quite difficult, but that's part of the process. And that slightly brings us back to the question also of like things you can do with a PhD that are maybe very slightly outside academia, which we'll get onto later. But like there are people who do doctorate degrees in the humanities in order to be able to write and communicate in other ways that don't exist solely inside the academy. So there are things like public historians and people who go on to do freelance work with the skills that they've acquired. But I think for me a big one was writing and communicating, and that comes out of humanities PhDs especially, I think. Were there any for you, Rachel? I'm going to keep thinking about the transferable skills, but
Yeah, there are two really big ones for me that I didn't realize before I started the PhD, but have become really apparent now. And one of them is digital skills. So even though I'm a medieval historian, I work with a very large amount of data, and learning how to store that, how to analyze that, how to use network analysis, how to create relational databases. All of these skills are very transferable. And I have used them outside of the academy when I've been working in jobs that are not at universities. And the most transferable skill, which I always talk about, and you'll probably hear this a lot from me, I'm afraid, is project management. That you can take absolutely anywhere into any industry, and the PhD will train you so well in that. And it's certainly not the only way to be trained in project management. But boy, when you finish PhD, you can go and run any project.
Yeah, as long as you finish it, that's the key, isn't it? That's the
Yeah.
proof that you can manage a project is that you finished it.
yeah, yeah. Come back to me in a year and ask how my project management skills are. What about you, Charlie? What do you think came out of yours?
I think the skill that I learned the most was how to communicate and teach my knowledge to another group of people. That could be another group of academics. So I'm at a conference and I'm giving a research presentation, or it could be in front of a group of school children who've come for a taster day at my university. But the fundamental ability to understand, what do my audience currently know? What am I going to try and teach them? And what do I need to show them in order for them to get there to that end point? Is something I think doing presentations, I've always been quite a people person. I like talking and meeting people face to face. And I think my favorite part of the PhD process was communicating my knowledge to different groups of people and knowing what your audience is going to expect, what they're going to want, what they're going to enjoy. Some audiences are going to be bored by certain things that other audiences might really like. So obviously, a route that some people might go down after they finish their PhDs is teaching. I say obviously because a lot of people I know who did PhDs are teachers. And I think it's a really, really strong proving ground for developing good teachers, I think, doing a PhD, because it makes you think really critically about that process.
And when we say teaching, I think, people generally think of secondary school students, but as Rachel pointed out, remaining in the academy involves teaching.
Yeah.
But also I think it can prepare you for teaching all sorts of people. It can prepare you for teaching in workshops based, based out of organizations or companies, people who run workshops for museums, artistic workshops, or historical workshops, whatever, often have an academic background with a doctorate degree,
And
adult education, that kind of thing.
One of the jobs I looked at before I got this latest short-term lecturing post, and when I was thinking of getting myself a more secure and stable and reassuring career path, one of the jobs I looked at was traveling around private companies and teaching people how to give PowerPoint presentations and how to do public speaking. And I thought that I really know how to do, because I've done it for the last 15 years of my life. The salary was good, the company car, medical plan and everything. And I thought, great, this is, why do I want to go back into academia? But here I am. So
but I think that's a really good example. I think, teaching exists in all sorts of levels of society. It's not just a question of primary or secondary school students, although that is also a big part of it.
So I think another one of our reasons why might you want to do a PhD, I think this might be Rachel's reason. So let's grill her on this. Although I know this happened to Rachael. A reason might be because you like your current supervisor or institution and you want to continue to learn more along those same lines. That happened to you, didn't it, Rachael?
Yeah, I really enjoyed doing my master's at the institution I was at, and I really enjoyed the kind of very like invigorating isn't quite the right word, but the conversations, they're very enthusiastic but very critical conversations that I was having both with my peers in that department as well as with the academics within the department, gave me a sense that this would be a good institution to continue to think critically, to push the boundaries of our knowledge, but also how we approach, in my case, the study of history. And so I wanted to keep working with the same supervisor that I've had during my master's, but also with the wider department. And so that really encouraged me to stay where I was rather than go elsewhere.
So can I just clarify a couple of things? Because some people are in all different situations, right? I know people who did undergraduate, master's, and PhD all at the same place with no break, straight the way through, because they just loved it. You moved between undergrad and masters, is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So I did my undergrad at not just a different institution, but also in a different country, and moved to the UK to do my master's, and then stayed on for my PhD. Which I would say, I know Charlie, you had a different experience. I think I can't remember where you did yours, but in general, I think moving institutions at some point can be quite helpful, encouraging you to think critically in different ways.
I did my undergraduate in the same country, but at a different institution, moved for my MA, and then stayed after my MA in the same place to do my PhD. My reflection on that was that I probably wish I had moved again for my PhD, not because I hated it, and I had a great time, loved it, met a load of people, including you, Rachel. But also, I think it's just, I rushed myself into the decision of doing a PhD, I think, and I think I made some things harder for myself in terms of finances and pressure on myself to try and force this through. Whereas I think if I may have had some time off, a little bit like Olivia did, I might have made that decision a bit more distant. Did you move, Olivia, between institutions?
Yeah, I did. I've been at a different institution for each of my degrees. Although interestingly, I didn't move countries, so I have an American accent, but I've done my entire education in the UK. And that was primarily for financial reasons. I was very clear with myself that I couldn't do a PhD self-funded. So I part of waiting on switching institutions had to do with who would fund me.
a really important
Well,
consideration.
And I do think it was a good thing to do. I think if an institution is really, really good and there's a really solid reason, like you had, Rachel, the topic appeals and the person to do it with is that person, and you really can't leave. I think there's no reason not to necessarily, but like you say, moving does give you different perspectives on the way different university departments approach different questions and the kind of perspectives and methodologies.
There isn't really a correct answer to that, is there?
Yeah.
It's different for everybody, different for every circumstance. But it can be a reason to want to do a PhD, can't it? That you're happy where you are and you like it and you're good at it, presumably, as well, because otherwise they wouldn't want you to stay.
Right.
Another reason we've got on the list is I have this from so I was asking someone I share an office with at work, what are your reasons for doing a PhD? And they said to me, because they felt like they had a topic that needed to be told and that their story they were researching needed to be shared with the world, and that's published as a PhD or published as articles and so on. I thought that was a really interesting motivation for wanting to do a PhD. They talked about a sense of duty around their topic, and if they hadn't done a PhD on it, they said they always would have felt like the people who featured in it were not having their voices heard. And I thought that was really interesting, kind of noble motivation for doing a PhD. Anyone got any of that? Because I haven't.
I think that can be harder to identify in medieval history, which is the background all three of us come from. Not impossible, but harder. But I think there are plenty of fields in the humanities out there where it's easy to see that you might settle on a question and start to kind of work towards the answer a little bit and think to yourself, this is something that needs to be told and I'm the person to tell it. This is a question that needs to be answered, and if I don't answer it, nobody else will. My institution has a department in refugee studies. I've previously worked in refugee affairs, so I can certainly see that a lot of those stories and questions need to be answered. Ditto the institute at my institution that deals with questions of law and that kind of thing. So I'm not saying it isn't possible in history or not possibly in medieval history, but it's harder to see, I think, than it is in plenty of other subjects.
Okay, let's wrap up with our last reason that we suggested. There are other reasons, but these are the ones we thought to discuss. Rachel, I'm going to hand this one to you because it's just your turn. Do you think anyone does a PhD because they want a pay rise and they're doing it for the money? Does anyone do a PhD for the money?
That's such a great question, Charlie. And I like that on your notes, you've got it with a question mark after it, because it's true. I think my experience is that maybe when I started doing a PhD, there's still this idea that you could make more money if you had a PhD, that you would be on a higher salary than someone without. Perhaps also coming from a North American background, where I think PhDs are sometimes monetarily valued higher than they are in UK. But I don't think anyone necessarily believes that you will make more money if you have a PhD now. I think, but that's my opinion. I don't think it necessarily inflates your salary. Thoughts from the rest of the room?
Thoughts from the room? Yeah, Olivia's thinking other industries. So, like, what do you think, Olivia?
Well, I guess I think that my understanding is that is still the impression in that is still the case, that a PhD will generally grow your salary if you go into industry from other subjects than necessarily the humanities. So my understanding, and I'm basing this on anecdotal evidence, but is that science and economics and such things, if you leave academia afterwards and go into industry, then your pay will generally be higher. I think we can reasonably say that's not the case anymore in the humanities.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about social sciences.
I look at people that I went to school with as a comparison, and none of them have got as much student debt as me. And all of them bought houses before me and kind of started making families and so on before me because they were financially and personally more secure. You can do all those things if you want to, while you're doing a PhD and don't have much money. But I'd say on balance, doing the PhD and the financial hit that you take from it, because your salary will be smaller while you're doing it, means that financially, humanities PhD can be tricky. So yeah, it depends what you want to do afterwards, doesn't it? We go back to the question that we asked at the beginning. Are you doing it because you want to be an academic? If you are, then I have news for you. Your salary is not going to be massive. If you're doing it because you want another kind of job, then
yeah. I think also one thing that didn't occur to me before I started, and that I really should have thought of, is that regardless of what your salary is going to be when you finish, the 4 years, and in the States it's 7, but the 3 to 4 years of doing a doctorate in the UK is income foregone. So even if you're funded, even if you're not paying for it yourself, you are losing out on that 4 years of income. And I think if I had done mine in my early 20s, that would have mattered less than having to do or deciding to have done one in my late 20s and early 30s, because my earning potential at this stage of my life is otherwise higher than it would have been when I was in my early 20s. I think I didn't really think about that, but that should have been a big consideration for me.
no regrets. No regrets.
No regrets.
No, but it's something to think about, right? And it's to hopefully our listeners will think about it now, even if we didn't. And
right.
I wonder,
that's
maybe...
entirely why we're doing this podcast, right? It's so that people can learn from our mistakes.
Right.
Shall I, Charlie, maybe move on to the next section?
Why don't you start us off on the next topic? Yeah.
Okay, so we have talked a lot about why we should do a PhD, or some of the reasons that you might want to do a PhD. But then the next natural question is, what is it actually like to do a PhD when you're actually in the thick of it? Because before you make this big decision, you need to kind of understand what your day-to-day life might look like, or at least the next kind of rough picture of the 3 to 4 years. And we have, I guess, about 4 different ideas that we've come up with. And I'm going to start us off. Well, actually, I'm going to ask Charlie maybe to speak about the first one, because the first thing that we've put down is that it's hard, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So it's not to start this section off on a gloomy note, but maybe Charlie, do you want to expand a little bit on why?
I wrote this, right? That was my idea to start by saying it's hard. It's meant to be. It's meant to be one of the hardest things that you'll ever do intellectually, a PhD. In the humanities, you're being asked to come up with a research question, to research the literature surrounding it, to write 100,000 words at the end of it that contain a coherent and persuasive argument. So that's not something you can just kind of knock up, is it, in a couple of months? I think also during a PhD, you can be overwhelmed by the scale of it at the beginning. How am I ever going to come up with anything new? There's pressure to come up with interesting and engaging topics. It can be a really difficult process. You can look at others around you and think they're doing better than you. We'll come on to motivation and imposter syndrome and all those kinds of topics later on, probably in our podcast series. But just so that you're aware, it's out there. It's psychologically a difficult thing to do a PhD, while others around you are maybe kind of flourishing. In your view, you look inwardly and think, oh, well, I'm struggling still. Why is it so hard for me? It's just a weird thing to do, isn't it? To just write like a whole massive project for 3 years, maybe 4, if you're in the States, 7, so whatever. It's hard, okay? I'm sorry, but it is.
It's really hard.
If you didn't know this,
I should have started with you, Olivia, because you're in the midst of
Olivia,
it.
why don't you tell us how difficult it is, and then you can circle it round and end by saying how fun it is.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's hard. I mean, but I think that's the point, and I would discourage anybody from going into it thinking that it's going to be easy or wanting to do it because it might be easy. But I think what I find, I mean, like you said, academically, it's challenging because you are setting yourself difficult questions, and because the process of uncovering information that nobody else has uncovered is not an easy one. I think that kind of aside, the really difficult stuff, or the stuff that comes up, I think, for a lot of people. And amongst other things, I live with two people who have PhDs and have finished at various stages. Like my best friend lives with me and she finished 6 months ago, and my other flatmate finished 3 years ago, and I have a cousin who quit her PhD about 5 years ago. So I'm surrounded by a couple of people who are kind of at different stages of it. But I think kind of the academic difficulty aside, the really challenging stuff has to do with the kind of psychology of it and the fact that you are this is your thing, and nobody, like your supervisor will help you, but nobody really cares about it except you. And which is not to say that it doesn't have importance or isn't going to be read by people and enjoyed, but in terms of nobody cares if you do or don't produce this thing. If you don't produce it, you write to your funder, or you say, sorry, I can't do it, and then you just go. It's your thing, and it's really internally driven and motivated. And I'm sure other people have other motivations as well, but you have to have that internal intrinsic motivation to do it. And then that comes with its own kind of whole host of psychological difficulties over, like, why am I doing it, and am I good enough, and what if I actually can't do it, and the day-to-day sitting down, figuring out what you need to do in a kind of unstructured project, structuring yourself, asking yourself what you need to do on a day-to-day basis, on a week-by-week basis, on a month-by-month basis, what you need to accomplish each term, when your deadline is going to be, that kind of thing, is it really forces you to look inward and to think about who you are and what you're doing. And I'm really lucky in the sense that a lot of people say that a PhD is a really lonely thing, and it is, in the sense that it's you and you're the only one who's going to make it happen. But I'm really lucky in that I'm surrounded by people who are either doing them or have done them, and we talk about it. We talk about it a lot. We talk about the psychology of it a lot, and I really could not be luckier in that sense. And you have to make sure that you're surrounded with good people in order to really get yourself through it, because there will be a lot of self-questioning along the way.
And I'd just like to jump off the back of that, Olivia, to say for our listeners that actually I don't think that you're necessarily lucky, Olivia, that you have so many people around you, and that if you're doing a PhD in at least a UK institution, but also probably in North American institutions as well, you will find that there are people in your department, in your school, in your faculty, that there are structures there that are built in to make sure that you can find other people who are going through similar experiences. So you don't necessarily have to feel like you're on your own. So that's just like to flag up for anyone who might be thinking about starting a PhD. Yes, it's lonely, but it's not about luck. Institutions do support their PhD students to make sure they have a community.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think we're at some point we're going to talk a bit about how you choose an institution. But I think it's like you say, institutions do have those. Most do, but the really good ones especially do. And some struggle to provide that. So I think it's useful to kind of think about. You're right. A good institution and an institution you want to be at should provide that kind of community and those kinds of opportunities.
You go, Rachel. You go.
Okay, I was just going to say that's one of the things we should circle back to when choosing what institution you might want to do your PhD at and doing research by that institution. One of those things is looking into the research culture, the PhD culture, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Peer support is absolutely invaluable while you're doing a PhD. And if you're listening to this and you're about to start a PhD, you know you've got a place confirmed. I cannot encourage you more to make friends with people around you. Make friends with people who are further on in the PhD process to you, because they'll explain things to you and they'll give you advice. Make friends when you're at their stage with people who are earlier than you, so that you can advise them, because the whole system relies a little bit on informal peer-to-peer mentoring in a way that you don't quite realize when you start off. And I think some of my best friends that I have in the academic world either did PhDs a little bit before me in my institution or a little bit after me in my institution. And I value those friendships hugely. So peer support is really important. I was going to say, Olivia, can you talk us about some positives? Because you had the idea that what is it like to do a PhD? It's fun. So tell us about the good thing.
It is also fabulously good fun. I mean, it's very freeing. And it's a real privilege, regardless of how you got into that position, to have the opportunity to spend so much time thinking about something that is entirely yours. And that's the flip side of the psychological difficulty, is that it is yours and it's yours to do with what you want, and that's freeing, and it's challenging, and it, you know, part of the reason I left the work I was doing outside the academy is that I just wasn't challenged, and the challenge of having a day-to-day of figuring out where the source material you want to see is, and going and finding it, and signing up to different libraries. And I'm very lucky in that I get to go look at dreadfully old medieval manuscripts, and I get to put my hands on them and nobody kicks me out of the British Library. And so, you know, it's fun. I think a big part of that is the privilege of being able to do it. I don't know, did you enjoy yours, Charlie? Did you have fun?
I mean, parts of it I hated. I mean, okay, I'll say this, I don't mind. The woman who I'm now married to, my girlfriend at the time, I broke down crying in the car when I picked her up from choir one night, saying, how am I ever going to finish this? What the hell am I doing with my life? And
We've all
probably
been
the reason
there.
why I'm married to her now, she helped me through, you know, like, she's good at that. But I think all of us who finished the PhD have got a story like that, or several of them. And I've helped other people in those situations. So I don't want to be all doom and gloom, because I also absolutely bloody loved doing my PhD. And it, you know, there are moments of intense highs and moments of really intense lows. And just like Olivia's been saying, those research trips, the conference trips where you get to meet people who are actually interested in what you're interested in, that tiny niche area, and you finally
Best
meet the
feeling
one
in the
person,
world,
isn't it? Like, you finally meet that one person in the world who cares about it just as much as you, and then you're worried they care about it more than you, so you panic a bit. And just kind of like, what I love about the topic is that you get to travel the world, less so now after COVID, but we get to travel the world and meet people, or meet them online from all different regions of the world, and we speak the same language, which is knowledge and passion for our subject. And none of us are afraid to show our love for our subject. And that to me is worth all the tears in the car late at night, whatever. So that's my positive.
yeah.
What about you,
feeling,
Rachel?
No,
Yeah,
go on,
finish
Olivia.
that sentence. But you can't start a sentence that says that feeling and then not finish.
I was just going to say, that feeling we've all had where we've waxed lyrical about, and when I say we, I mean everybody in the world, where you wax lyrical about the thing that cares, that you really care about, and then you're kind of met with dead silence. The joy of doing a doctorate is that eventually you will find somebody who gets just as excited, like more than once you'll find somebody who gets just like listens to all of that and then gets just as excited about it as you do. And like I say, that feeling is the best in the world.
It's so good. Oh, even now, like having done a PhD and working in the field, like it's so great going to conferences and meeting other people who care about what you care about, what you spend your whole life thinking about, too much time thinking about. I just maybe like to also flag a few positives too that I found from doing my PhD. And it also goes back to this idea of freedom and you being in charge of your project, but it also gives you a lot of scope to do things that aren't necessarily related to the PhD at all. But because you have so much control over your working life and that balance of your working life, it means that you can, I at least pursued some kind of community-based projects during my PhD that were, yes, about history, but not necessarily about what I was doing my PhD on. And I found those really rewarding. And because I didn't have to work to someone else's time scale or spend 9 to 5 on this job, it meant that I was able to pursue that for like, you know, 2 months or whatever, and then kind of go back to focusing more heavily on the PhD and things like that. So I think for me doing PhD, that was one of the best things, having that freedom that you will not have in any other traditional job unless you're doing consulting or working freelance. Maybe like to also flag a few positives too that I found from doing my PhD. And it also goes back to this idea of freedom and you being in charge of your project, but it also gives.
Okay, great. So there is immense freedom with doing a PhD, and we talked about some of the things, lifestyle, working patterns, and all those kinds of things, and intellectual freedom. But there are also some things that look a bit different to other people's jobs. And I think they're worth touching on. So did Rachel, you write this bit, or was it Olivia who wrote this bit?
I wrote that bit.
Okay, so Rachel, tell us, like, what do you think about the idea of like life freedom? Let's call it.
Okay, I think one of the things to acknowledge is that I am first generation, so that kind of definitely plays into my experience of education and doing a PhD, but also just doing any degrees at a university, is that um, there's this thing which we've slightly touched upon, or Olivia talked about, in terms of looking at other people's lives. Often when you're doing a PhD, you look at what everyone else is doing in their PhD and being like, oh my God, I'm so far behind, or they're doing it better than I am. And there is still that opportunity to look at people's lives who are not doing a PhD, particularly if you grew up in a community where other people haven't done a PhD, maybe haven't even gone to university. And so their lifestyles and where they are, the stages of their lives, look very different. And when you choose to do a PhD, that is 3 to 4 years in which you can have all these big events, we think of very traditional moments in life, which we don't need to conform to them, but weddings and children and all of that. And sometimes it is a little bit harder to build those things into your PhD, and you will find, or you can find sometimes, that your friends' lives look very, very different, because that is 4 years of more education that you're doing. So I just think it's important that, like, that's something I didn't think about before I started my PhD, and struck me as I was going through it.
Yeah. See, I feel like people who, a lot of, not everybody, but a good number of people who go down the academic PhD path in the arts and humanities are doing it in their 20s, and they're kind of getting towards the end of their 20s when they finish, or their mid-30s, depending on when they began. And then that's when you do the whole children settle down, buy a house, and that kind of thing. It's kind of after you've done it. And it's not always the way. And like you said, we don't want to conform to these things and reinforce them. But just anecdotally looking around at other people that I know who've done PhDs, it tends to happen. So I think people need to be aware that you might meet the love of your life while you're doing a PhD. But then, like, you might not be able to actually settle down with them until after you finish the damn thing, because there's 3 people in the room at that point. Well, I mean, some people want to marry 3 people, don't they? But whatever,
I did meet the love of my life during my PhD, so I'll go
So
let him
did
know.
I.
It's actually 3 people in the room.
Also, same.
Right.
So another thing for people to help make their decision: beware, you may meet the love of your life if you do a PhD. So,
A reason to do a PhD.
Definitely, we're not putting that on the list of reasons.
no,
we do not maintain any responsibility for whether or not you meet the love of your life during your PhD.
Oh my goodness. Well,
I think Rachel's point is sorry. I think Rachel's point is a really good one, because related, maybe kind of in terms of how one thinks about one's PhD in advance, but related is the fact that a lot of the time, especially depending on what stage of your life you start one in, it's kind of unclear whether the time that you're spending studying for this degree is time where you're a student or time where you're working. That boundary, I think, can be kind of blurred quite a lot. And between whether it's work or, especially if you've worked, been in the world of work beforehand, and haven't gone straight through. I certainly sort of treat mine like a job, or I try to. But but then if you treat it like a job, then you're looking at all of your friends' jobs and you're going, they make far more than me, and they're, like we say, like they're in financial security of some way, shape, or form, where they're producing children, and I wish I could, or thank God I don't have to, or have that pressure. Those kinds of distinctions are just there. Those comparisons are there, and it's like Rachel says, I think it's worth being aware of that when going into it. That it's always a little unclear what you're doing with your life, and again, you have to bring it back to your own motivation and say, this is what I'm doing in my life and with my life, and this is why.
Cool. Okay. I think we've said a lot to our listeners, and hopefully we haven't kind of bombarded you with information. Don't forget to use the pause and rewind functions for any of this, because you're very welcome to do that. What you'll find is, attached to every one of our podcasts, there'll be a short blog with some summaries of what we've talked about. And there will also be some useful links that we think might help you, of anything we discuss in future episodes that we want to link in. We'll put them in there as well, so that you can follow our materials. But I guess, like, we did run out of time to talk about all the things we want to talk about. So the next time we meet, look out for it. In episode 2, we're going to talk about topics like How do you know that you've got a good topic for a PhD? And how do you choose a supervisor for a PhD? And how does the process of even applying for PhDs actually work? So if you listen to this podcast, you've decided you definitely want to do one, then we're going to give you some information in the next session about how to actually use that information and what to do with it in the arts and humanities. So I'm going to be cruel and ask my other two co-hosts to just give us like their ultimate piece of advice for helping to make the PhD decision. If you could give one piece of advice to the listeners that might help them, that you wish someone had given to you when you were deciding whether to do a PhD, Olivia, what would it be?
Tune in as much as you possibly can to what you actually want.
Ah, cool. So make sure it's you making the decision.
Yeah.
Cool. And Rachel, what's yours?
That is such a cool question, Charlie. I guess my piece of advice would be to go into the PhD thinking about seizing every opportunity that comes your way that may not look as though it's related to your PhD topic. But if something comes up and you're remotely interested in it, give it a go. Now's the opportunity to try new things, and you never know what you'll discover along the way.
Oh, that's a bit cryptic as well. I like that. I'm going to cheat and I'm going to say two things because I'm the last person speaking. I've got two, and they're two opposite views of this spectrum. The first one is, if you really want to do a PhD and you've got the grade and you really, really want to do a PhD, just do it. Whatever obstacles, just if you know that you want to do it and you can afford to do it, you've got the grades or whatever, make it happen. Because if you don't, you may regret it. Second piece of advice, know where it's going to take you is the other thing. It's fine to start a PhD just thinking I'm interested in this topic and I'm going to explore it and so on. But a bit like Olivia's point, know what's driving that. Know what's motivating you to do this PhD and have it in your mind, because that's what's going to sustain you, I think.
And I think it's fine if that changes over time, but as long as you're clear from the
the
beginning.
Yeah, totally.
As long as you're always clear what that motivation is.
I think that's so important, isn't it? It's the motivation to get out of bed, or some people may work in bed, I don't know, but at least they are. And, like, you know, do some work that day, that's going to sustain you.
Yeah.
So anyway, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Do leave us some feedback and tell us what you liked and what you think could be improved. And also tell us if you have suggestions for other topics you'd like us to talk about on a future episode. We're more than happy to consider them and work through them, because we think that early career researchers in humanities have got a lot on their plate these days. And we want to try and offer our suggestions. And we never give answers to anything, but hopefully by listening to us share our experiences and our reactions to certain situations, we can all learn some things, and maybe we can learn some things from you as well in your feedback. So we look forward to hearing from you. So goodbye from me, Charlie, and it's goodbye from Olivia.
Bye.
And it's goodbye from Rachel.
Goodbye.
And thank you for listening to the Early Career Podcast. We will see you again soon.